Yes.
Okay. So good morning once again. And as I mentioned, today's talk will be on X-ray diffraction and its application in the engineering industry, keeping in mind most of the mechanical engineers who are listening to my talk today. Just to give a brief background about Central X-ray Diffraction Lab, it is one of the very old X-ray diffraction labs in the country. It was established in the late 1960s with a funding of around 200,000 to 300,000 German Deutsche Mark. Professor R. Vasudevan, who was the first head of the lab, you can see him here. So he was instrumental in establishing this lab. And after he retired, Professor Keshavan Nair was the second head of the lab, and I'm the third one who is heading this lab. And this was the first lab which was established in IIT Madras to cater to not only academia, but also the industries in and around Chennai. And all of you know that Chennai is an automobile hub, and the interest was to see if X-ray diffraction lab can assist the local industries. Sometime in the 70s, Professor Eckhard Macherau from the University of Karlsruhe visited Central X-ray Diffraction Lab, and he's a pioneer in the area of residual stresses. And he introduced the concept of residual stresses and how to determine residual stresses by X-ray diffraction. And I think since then, our lab has been very well known in the area of X-ray diffraction, using X-ray diffraction techniques for the measurement of residual stresses. We interact with a large number of industries. As you see in the pie chart here, predominantly we interact with automobile industries or industries which make spare parts for automobiles. And that's very nice because we have experience interacting with a large number of industries solving various kinds of engineering problems. And we use X-ray diffraction techniques to solve these problems. For people who may not be aware of X-ray diffraction and the basics, what I will do is that the next 15 minutes, I'll spend some time to give you an idea of how X-rays are produced and how to use X-rays to solve material science problems. So production of X-rays is a very simple process. You need an anode and you need a cathode. Under a very high potential difference, the high energy electrons are bombarded onto the target and X-rays are produced. So that's a very simple way of telling you how X-rays are produced. So these high energy electrons interact with the anode or target material and X-rays are produced. And X-ray production is a very inefficient process. I keep telling several times whenever I teach young students that X-ray production is a very inefficient process because most of the electron interaction with the target material is converted to heat, and only less than 1% comes out as X-rays. And X-rays typically have a wavelength less than that of visible light. Therefore, you cannot see X-rays. If you look at the electromagnetic spectrum here, you see that the X-rays are on the right side of the visible wavelength. And as you go more towards the right side, the wavelength reduces, and gamma rays are on the extreme right with an extremely short wavelength. So X-rays are high energy electromagnetic radiations, and these X-rays have a wavelength in the order of around 10 power minus 9 to 10 power minus 11 nanometers, which is typically in the dimensions of the bond lengths and interplanar spacings, and therefore X-rays are very good to be used to understand material science problems. On the right-hand side, you see a simple schematic of an X-ray tube. So this is a highly evacuated tube in which you have a cathode here and you have an anode here. In this specific case, the anode is you have a filament tungsten here, sorry, and you have the anode copper here. So electrons are bombarded onto the target, and then X-rays are produced. And if X-rays are produced, they have to come out of the X-ray tube. So you have beryllium windows. So beryllium is a low atomic number element, so they are transparent to X-rays. So therefore, beryllium is very ideal to be used as X-ray windows. So X-rays come out of these beryllium windows. And these X-rays can be used for variety of materials to solve diffraction problems. So typically, we are talking of power in the range of 2 to 3 kilowatts, and we use voltage of around 40 to 80 kilovolts, around 25 to 50 milliamps to generate X-rays. You must know what kind of interactions typically happens when electrons are bombarded onto the target. So to get an idea of what kind of radiation comes. So if the electrons that are ejected out of the filament, if they get decelerated as they approach the target, and that loss in energy has to be manifested in some form, and they are manifested in the form of varied wavelengths. They are called Bremsstrahlung, or breaking radiation in English. If the electrons that come out of the filament, if they knock off some of the electrons, then these electrons are excited, and when they are returning back to their ground state, they emit characteristic radiation. So that is specific to the target material, and we call it as characteristic X-ray radiation. So when electrons from the filament interact with the anode, you have both. You have Bremsstrahlung, that is, you have X-rays of varied wavelengths, and you also have characteristic X-ray radiation. So if you look at on the left hand side, this is a textbook example of how X-rays can be produced. You will see that with increase in voltage at lower voltages like 10 kilovolts or 15 kilovolts or even 20 kilovolts for molybdenum, we are talking of target metal molybdenum, and until around 20 kilovolts, you just have Bremsstrahlung. That is, you have wavelength of varied wavelengths. And you require a critical voltage. In this specific case, we are talking about 25 kilovolts. And at critical voltage of 25 kilovolts, you have characteristic radiation coming out of it. You have K alpha and K beta, which is characteristic to that material. And in the same slide, if you see below, you see that depending on the atomic number, the voltage that is required to generate characteristic radiation can be different. For example, for chromium, you see this is how it is, and for molybdenum, you see characteristic radiation is generated. For tungsten, it takes much higher voltage because tungsten has a very high atomic number. So the intensity of the continuous spectra depends strongly on the voltage and the atomic number, as you see from this equation. So if you require a very high Bremsstrahlung, or if you require a very high white radiation, then tungsten is the target that is used. And you will see that in most of the X-ray diffractometers, we don't use tungsten. We use copper or molybdenum or chromium, because if you use tungsten, you require a very high critical voltage to generate characteristic radiation. On the right-hand side, you see how K alpha and K beta looks like. So they appear at specific wavelengths, and whether you have K alpha, K beta. So these K alpha, K beta are specific to the electronic transitions. Depending on what kind of electronic transitions you have, you get K alpha, K beta, and so on. And K alpha, of course, is a doublet. That is K alpha 1 and K alpha 2 appearing at 0.709 angstrom and 0.7 angstroms. But however, for all practical considerations, we take a weighted average of K alpha. But please do remember that increase in voltage does not change the characteristic wavelengths of the target. So if you keep that minimum critical voltage that is required to generate characteristic radiation, that should be more than sufficient. And this is a spectrum that is shown for molybdenum at 35 kilovolts. So it doesn't matter even if you increase the voltage to 35 or more than 35, like 40 kilovolts or whatever, the wavelength of the characteristic radiation will not change. Now to summarize, so X-ray interaction with matter is extremely complex. So what I am showing here to you is you have a sample here. X-rays are projected. So till now what I discussed was how X-rays are produced. And now once X-rays are produced, these X-rays have to be interacting with samples of our interest. So now we are talking about X-rays of some intensity I0, which are interacting with some sample of your interest. You could be if these X-rays could be interacting with aluminum, copper, whatever material that is of interest to you. I0 basically represents the intensity of the beam that you are using. And once X-rays interact with matters, a lot of things can happen. You can have, once X-rays interact with matter, so they do get scattered. And if the scattered wavelength is more than, or if it changes, then we call that as there is a change in wavelength. That's a Compton. That is what we call it as Compton shift, and that is an incoherent scattering process. So when you have change in wavelength after the scattering process, we call it that as an incoherent scattering process, and that is not useful for us. That is not useful for materials engineers because that is not in phase with the wavelength that is incident, and therefore you will not be able to imagine this Compton shift or incoherent scattering process responsible for any diffraction. You can also have another situation where the wavelength of the scattered radiation is the same as that of the incident radiation. If the wavelength of the scattered radiation is the same as that of the incident radiation, then we call that as Thomson coherent scattering. It is called coherent scattering because there is no change in wavelength. There is a wavelength after scattering, and the wavelength before scattering, they are the same. And therefore, this kind of scattering is more important for us because this kind of coherent scattering is in phase with the incident beam, and therefore that is something that is important in the diffraction process. And what you see here is IE, that means it refers to the intensity of the scattered radiation scattered by one single electron. And if you look at this expression, 2 theta basically refers to the scattering angle, I naught basically refers to the intensity of the beam, and rest of the parameters are related to the electron. M refers to the mass of the electron, charge on the electron, and so on. And R represents the radius at which the electron is located from some origin. Now, if you look at this expression, what I wanted to specify to you, or what I wanted to highlight to you, is it is always the electrons in the atoms which scatter the electrons. And you may ask why? Why does only electron scatter X-rays and why not protons? Please see that mass comes in the denominator for this expression. And mass of the proton is something like 1836 times larger than that of the electron. So if the mass is very, very high, then the intensity, scattered intensity, will be very, very low. So therefore, protons cannot scatter X-rays. Only electrons can scatter X-rays. So therefore, electrons are the scatterer of X-rays. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. So when X-rays interact with matter, you can have both. You can have incoherent scattering and coherent scattering. But what is important for us is coherent scattering. And incoherent scattering can result in the background, which I will talk about it. Or even if I don't talk about it, you can always ask me if you want to know more about it. But apart from that, you also have absorption of X-rays. So when X-rays interact with matter, they also can get absorbed. And if you have some kind of a photoelectric absorption, then there is ejection of electrons, and this ejection of electrons can again return back, and therefore you may have to the ground state, leading to photons of longer wavelength causing fluorescent radiation, which is again not very useful for diffraction, but they are observable. So Compton scattering as well as fluorescent radiation, they are observable. And absorption of X-rays typically depends on the mass absorption coefficient of the material. For example, if you take a high atomic number element, that absorbs X-rays more than a material with a low atomic number. So that is the reason why, for example, all the shields that are used to cover radiation is made of leaded glasses, because lead can absorb X-rays. So the intensity of the X-rays can be directly correlated with the mass absorption coefficient of the material. So any material will absorb X-rays. You will be surprised to know that even air can absorb X-rays. For example, 1 meter of air can absorb more or less 97% of chromium X-ray radiation, for instance, just to give you an idea of how even ambient air can absorb X-rays. So the total intensity is typically given by the sum of the intensities of both coherent and incoherent scattering. So that gives you a basic understanding of the scattering process. So scattering and diffraction does not mean one and the same. So scattering, and every diffraction process is a scattering process. But every scattering need not lead to diffraction. So that is something that you must be aware of. So now what is diffraction? The first diffraction experiment was done in Munich. So it is popularly known as the Munich experiment. It was Max von Laue in Germany who first demonstrated that materials which are crystalline in nature can be used as diffraction gratings for X-rays. And he showed by around 1912, he published 2 papers in German. It's called, it was published in the Bayerische Akademische der Wissenschaften, that means the Bavarian Academy of Sciences. So he published 2 papers in 1912. And in those papers, he published that crystalline materials can act as diffraction gratings. And by using a photographic plate, he could record the diffraction pattern as you see here on the right-hand side. And he showed that the orientation of the crystal determines the spot patterns. In fact, that was a very interesting experiment. And this experiment actually led to a very interesting consequence, which people were not aware of. So if you look at the same experiment written in schematic here to make you understand, so it is in transmission mode. So when he incident X-rays of varied wavelengths, so the diffracted rays were captured on a photographic film, and you can see the spots here, and the spots indicating coherent interference of X-rays by crystal planes. And for the first time, he was able to demonstrate the wave nature of X-rays. So until then, people were not very clear whether how should X-rays be thought of, whether it should be thought of as packets of energy or whether they should be considered as wave nature. And at least he was able to demonstrate the wave nature of X-rays for the first time. And until this experiment, it was not clear how materials would look like. And therefore, please remember, there was no electron microscopy at that point of time. So he was the first person to some kind of demonstrate the periodic arrangement of atoms and the existence of crystal planes. So that also means that X-ray diffraction will work only for crystalline materials and not for non-crystalline materials. So when 1912, when he did this experiment, he got his first Nobel Prize. He got his Nobel Prize. I would say first Nobel Prize in the area of diffraction, but he got his Nobel Prize in 1914. And after he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1914, the Braggs, the father and son, William Lawrence Bragg and William Henry Bragg, did the same experiment in UK. And they showed the experiment of diffraction in a much better way, in a much elegant way, and in a much simpler way. What they showed was that diffraction can occur in a way such that once the X-rays are incident on crystal planes, and if the position between the planes are such that coherent interference takes place, then diffraction would occur. So they were able to show that so long that the path difference is equal to the integer multiple of the wavelength, then coherent interference is possible and diffraction could occur. So they came out with a well-known equation which we call as Bragg's law. That is 2 multiplied by the interplanar spacing. So DHKL is the interplanar spacing multiplied by sine theta, which is the sine of the half of the Bragg angle, equal to n lambda, where lambda is the wavelength of the X-ray used and n is the order of diffraction. So everybody must know this law already, at least people who are in the area of material science, that n lambda is equal to 2d sine theta is a well-known Bragg's law. And I always say that all the X-ray diffraction, however complicated problems you try to solve, they're all based on Bragg's law. And this Bragg's law is very interesting. If you look at this schematic, it doesn't matter how the atoms are positioned. What is important is the interplanar spacing. So interplanar spacing is the only thing which matters here. It doesn't matter where the atoms are located. So many times you might have seen in the textbook like this, AB equal to BC kind of situation, but that's not really required. AB need not be equal to BC. What is important is only the path difference AB plus BC. So it doesn't matter how the atoms are located on the plane. What is important is only the distance between these atomic planes and the Bragg angle. So that will determine whether certain kind of planes will diffract or not. And we call it as reflection as well. We also call many times this as Bragg reflection because this is looking like more or less like a mirror. Crystal planes will look like a mirror, acting as like if you have a mirror where if you show a torch, it would reflect something similar to that. So it would behave like crystal planes would behave like shiny optical mirrors, and therefore the diffracted signals are considered as reflections. But in principle, you must remember, although we call it as reflections, X-rays are actually scattered by electrons bound to the atoms, and they're not reflected in reality. So don't get confused when we talk about reflections. When we talk about Bragg reflections, don't imagine that X-rays are actually reflected. X-rays are not reflected. X-rays are only diffracted by the electrons. But it is a convenient terminology to use that X-ray reflection takes place because it's easier to imagine that way, as you see from the Bragg's way of interpreting the diffraction part. So now another important aspect that one should be aware of when you look at, so this is as far as the basics of X-ray diffraction is concerned, but when we look at the actual experiment, so this is how, if you look at the X-ray diffractometer and open the shielding glass, so you will see an X-ray source here, you will see a detector here, and you will see a sample stage. And this is the whole mechanical goniometer. And rest of it will be electronics and a computer interface, which will help you to operate the X-ray diffractometer. What we actually follow is what is called as the Bragg-Brentano geometry. So in most of the powder diffraction, we follow the Bragg-Brentano geometry. That means we have a goniometer circle. So this is the goniometer, okay, with a particular radius. So you can actually set the source and detector to follow the radius. So S represents the source, D represents the detector. The sample is kept at the center. it is very, very important to keep the sample at the center of the goniometer circle. If you do not keep the sample at exactly at the center of the goniometer circle, then you will have errors. So I'm not going to discuss about the errors, but I would like to highlight the fact that this is what is called as Bragg-Brentano geometry, in which the sample is kept at the center of the goniometer, which helps in parafocusing geometry. And this geometry requires actually the sample to be curved, but in reality, that is not possible. In reality, you always have a flat sample that you would place on the stage. And therefore, that also will lead to the error, which I'm not going to focus today. But all that I'm trying to highlight at this point of time is that in any powder diffractometer, we follow Bragg-Brentano geometry and get the diffraction signals. So what is the output? The output is an X-ray diffractogram, which you will get it from the detector. So it depends on what kind of detector you would keep here, whether you have a one-dimensional detector or a two-dimensional detector. That would determine what kind of a diffraction signal that you will get. Let us assume that you have a one-dimensional detector. And if you have a one-dimensional detector, then you are going to cut across the diffraction rings. And what you actually get is an X-ray diffractogram, which looks like this. Now, this is an X-ray diffractogram of a polycrystalline aluminum, and the diffraction planes are indicated here. So when you see 111 or 200, they're all the planes which are diffracting. The higher order reflections do appear only at higher 2 theta angles. That is, these are diffractions coming from the subspacings. And at what angle these planes diffract depends on whether Bragg's law is satisfied or not. And that is understood from the so-called structure factor calculations. So usually I teach this for the entire semester. This is a course which I teach for the entire semester and tell them in detail about how all these terminologies come into picture. But since it is a short talk of 1.5 hours, so I'm not, I will not have time to describe that. But I'm going to summarize this whole concept in the order of this intensity, in the form of this intensity expression. So what I see here, or what you see here, is an intensity expression. What is this intensity? This is the intensity of the diffracted signal captured from a particular peak of a certain material that is under consideration. Now, for example, if you take F here, F is called as a structure factor, which is basically referring to the crystal structure of any given material. So depending on what material you are investigating, the crystal structure would be different. For example, molybdenum has a BCC crystal structure. Aluminum has an FCC structure. So depending on which crystal structure you are dealing with, certain planes will diffract or certain planes will not diffract. So which planes will diffract or not diffract depends on the structure factor. So that is where this F comes into picture. P is called as the multiplicity factor, which basically takes into account the symmetry. So the symmetrically oriented directions. And these would determine what would be the intensity of the peak. Why certain peaks are more intense than the others will be determined by the multiplicity factor, primarily governed by the crystal symmetry. Now this 1 plus cos square theta divided by 2 sine square theta cos theta is called as the Lorentz polarization factor. This Lorentz polarization factor, you will see that if you actually take a plot of it, and if you have some interest, you can actually plot this Lorentz polarization factor as a function of 2 theta. Then you will realize that this Lorentz polarization factor has very high values at 2 theta less than 40 degrees, and again at higher 2 theta angles. So they are more relevant at low scattering angles and higher scattering angles. Omega is the atomic volume of the unit cell. E to the power of minus 2m refers to the temperature factor. You must remember that even at room temperature, you have some amount of vibrations of the atoms, and these vibrations of the atoms will affect the intensity. And you will see that the reduction in the intensity as you go to higher and higher 2 theta angles also comes directly because of this e to the power of minus 2m factor, because m is a function of scattering angle again. So if you take, for example, an X-ray diffractogram at room temperature of a given material, as well as if you take an X-ray diffractogram of the same material at higher temperatures, like at 200 degrees Celsius, the intensities will be much lower at higher temperatures, simply because of this minus 2m factor. This is called as the Debye-Waller factor, which Debye and Waller came out sometime in the mid-30s, sometime in 1934. They published a paper of how thermal vibrations in the crystalline lattice would affect the vibration, would affect the intensity. Mu refers to the absorption, which I have already referred to. So you always have some amount of absorption of X-rays when you incident X-rays on any given material. So this expression is called as the integrated intensity expression for a specific diffraction peak. So let us say that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 peaks here in this aluminum material. You can write the integrated intensity expression for all these 5 and calculate why this intensity comes like this. So this much of idea is sufficient to have, or at least you should have before we even discuss further about how to use X-ray diffraction techniques to solve engineering problems. So I have tried to summarize in a very, very short way of how X-rays are produced and how diffraction takes place and how an intensity of a peak is written for any crystalline lattice. Now, as engineers, we have to use these techniques to solve problems. And how do we make use of X-ray diffraction techniques to solve engineering problems? This is a very interesting part. And you will see why it is interesting. Now, to solve engineering problems, of course, you should have a strong engineering background. For example, if you are looking at automotive industry, you are talking about fact that you should have a basic degree in mechanical engineering. There's a spelling mistake. Sorry, you should have a strong background in design or mechanics. You should have a strong background in metallurgy, and also you should have strong background in X-ray diffraction. Only when you have a strong background in all these 3 parameters, then you can use X-ray diffraction techniques to solve engineering problems. Now let me go to the engineering aspect. So whenever you are in the industry, I think most of you would join the industry at some point of time. And if you happen to be either in production or design, the interest would be always to see what is the life of a component, a design component, and make sure that they do not fail. So the failure of a component or life of a component is dependent on several factors. They are dependent on the processing conditions. They are dependent on the alloy chemistry. They are dependent on the environment that the component is subjected to. Stresses, the external stresses, internal stresses. Most of the engineers try to design components based on the external loads, but many of them do not consider the internal stresses that might exist in the material. The surface treatments and surface defects or internal defects, all of them would determine the life or failure of a component. Now let me start with a few examples of metallurgical failure so that you get an idea of why this field is important. And in the industry, nobody wants failure. Nobody wants components to fail. And it is very important for engineers to make sure that you have a failure-free component and a component which can function over an extended period of time, at least for the design life period. What I'm showing you is a failed section of a leaf spring of a truck. You see that this is a fractured leaf spring. And I have not done any microscopy. I have not done any complicated characterization to check this. But visual inspection already gives us an idea of where the crack origin is. And most of these leaf springs are typically short peened on the surface to introduce residual compressive stresses on the surface. Because most of these failures of such as leaf spring and so on, they are fatigue failures. And fatigue failures are usually surface failures. And surface failures are usually initiated by tensile stresses on the surface. And therefore, to improve the fatigue life, what people do is people do short peening to introduce compressive stress on the surface so that the fatigue life is improved to a large extent. So in this specific case, you see that there are multiple crack origins, there are several stress concentration points, and you have a large overload zone. And all these things can be concluded just by visual inspection. And this is a fatigue failure problem. And you will see how X-ray diffraction is connected with all this later. I'll show you one more example. This is a zinc plated pin. It's an electroplated pin. And an electroplated pin which has failed. And it has failed in a very brittle manner, a ductile metal failing in a brittle manner. And that's what you see here. If you look at the left-hand side photograph, you see that it's a typical brittle failure. And if you look at the micrograph in scanning electron microscopy, you see a lot of short disconnected cracks. And this is a typical signature for hydrogen embrittlement. For most of the electroplated samples, hydrogen embrittlement is a common cause for failure. So you need to know that if you are working with electroplated samples, you should know how to process them, how to make sure that baking is appropriate enough to make sure that the diffusion of hydrogen is minimized, and embrittlement caused due to hydrogen diffusion is minimized to a large extent. I'll show you one more example of a failure of a gear tooth. And typically in the for gears, what they do is they do, of course, they do short peening on the surface of the flank, but they also do root rolling, because most of the times this root is a geometrical discontinuity, and cracks can get initiated at the root, and therefore root rolling is done to make sure that you introduce compressive stresses at the root, so that the initiation of any crack at the root is extended for a large time. And but here again, you can have failure if your processing conditions are not taken care of properly. So the failure reasons could be either residual stress or it could be retained austenite. And now we have to determine them. And unless you quantify them, you have no way of making solutions available to the industry, and you have no way of handling this problem. So which means if you are looking at failure analysis of a component, we are looking at a comprehensive analysis. And I would always say this as some kind of a post-mortem. That is, when you do a post-mortem, you should know what could be the reason, and it is usually carried out by the process of elimination. So when we look at the failed sample, we are actually looking at the post-mortem, and identifying the right reason is important by a process of elimination. And in today's talk, what I will do is, since most of you are from engineering discipline, I'm trying to emphasize the fact of the role of residual stresses, or how important this subject of distortion engineering is in the design of components for failure prevention using X-ray diffraction techniques. So I'm trying to connect distortion engineering with X-ray diffraction techniques in today's talk, which is very, very relevant for engineers. Now, some of the terminologies should be very clear. When I say failure, failure doesn't necessarily mean fracture. Failure only means that the component that you have designed fails to perform its intended function. But then, when you talk about failure, typically it is associated with distortion. And distortion, when it is extreme, okay, and that distortion, extreme form of distortion, lead to fracture, which is associated with initiation of cracks and propagation. And I always consider distortion to be a manifestation of residual stresses. So distortion is a manifestation of residual stresses. So when you have a residual stress, so typically it tend to distort. Now you can see how distortion is associated with. So distortion is associated with volume changes. For example, I was talking about retained austenite. So retained austenite, when it is a typical thing which is seen when you are looking at heat treatment of components. And if you have retained austenite, very large amount of retained austenite is a metastable phase. So it can convert into martensite in service. And if it converts to martensite, you have volume changes. And this volume changes can lead to distortion. So that is why I said these volume changes associated with retained austenite must be quantified. X-ray diffraction will be a useful tool. And again, phase transformation. You can understand phase transformation using X-ray diffraction. Residual stress associated with elastic deformation can be directly connected with X-ray diffraction. So most of these engineering problems can be resolved and quantified using X-ray diffraction. So that makes X-ray diffraction a very, very powerful tool to solve engineering problems. So that is why I said the Central X-ray Diffraction Lab in IIT Madras is not like any other X-ray diffraction lab which you will see in a physics lab. Because in a physics lab, possibly they use it for solving material science problems. So, but we use it to solve engineering problems. Now, you must be wondering, why am I actually stressing this point? You must understand that distortion problem is a very serious issue in the industry. The financial implications are huge, and distortion doesn't matter. I mean, which country you live in, you have to live with it and you have to deal with it. And it doesn't matter what industry you are dealing with, you have to deal with it. For example, just to give you an idea of what is the kind of financial implications that we are talking of, I have an old data because it's not so easy to get very latest data. The 1995 data published by the University of Bremen, when they did this survey, they found out that they were talking about 850 million euros just coming from the heat treatment industry of the German machining industry, automotive industry, and the transmission industry. That is something like $1 billion US. And Boeing, sometime in 2001, came out with a report on 4 aircraft programs where they estimated just because of rework and scrap cost due to distortion was in the order of around $290 million. So you can imagine what kind of losses, financial implications that we are talking of. So I'll just give you one more example of how distortion in machine components is possible and how it can occur. And many times this is not something which is intuitively understandable. There are 3 cases here. On the left-hand side, you see the y-axis is residual surface stress. And on the x-axis, we are talking about distance across the width. And we are talking about machining and fixture prior to heat treatment, okay? And now we are talking of 3 different cases: abusive A, abusive B, and gentle C. You can imagine that there are 3 operators in the machine shop, and they have 3 different ways of machining the component. Now you see one of the operators can introduce a tensile stress as high as 700 MPa. And another operator who is very good can introduce a compressive stress of around minus 500 MPa. Now, what is the point? The point is just surface grinding can introduce either tensile stress or compressive stress. And you may be wondering, why is it important? It is important because these residual stresses are algebraically additive. Let us say that you have designed the component to withstand around, let's say 1000 MPa. And you already have 600 MPa of tensile stress. That means it can only withstand 400 MPa more. That's all. So definitely we would not like to have a tensile residual stress on the surface. So it's very, very important for us to understand how stresses can be generated even by a simple surface grinding process, as in the case of this alloy steel, what I'm showing you here. Now let me talk about distortions in the automotive industries. Now we are talking about global output of automotive industries, which is like 86 million vehicles approximately, a report published in 2014. And I'm talking about a transmission gearbox. And typically in a transmission gearbox, you have a lot of gears, which actually goes into the passenger car, for instance. And when we talk about gears, we are talking about precision. We are talking about high dimensional precision. And usually they are subjected to some kind of a hardening process. The parameters are seen here. You are expected to have a surface hardness of around 58 to 62 HRC, and they are typically case hardened. But that's not the point. The point is that these are surface treated to impact the right mechanical properties. But what is the problem? The problem is that when the case hardening process, when the surface treatment is not uniform, then you can lead to distortion. And this distortion have to be corrected. If you don't correct this distortion, then you can see what is the financial implication. I have already told you about 850 million euros per year in the German industry, particularly in the automotive and gearbox industry. And we are talking about 1 billion euros per year in the bearings industry, as published by University of Bremen in 1995. And we are talking about, if you extrapolate to global industry, we are talking about a loss of 20 billion euros per year. Now, a few days back, I was giving a talk to a few industries. And I was telling them that I think Indian industries should actually calculate what is the loss that is involved in just distortion corrections. And that will show the importance of distortion engineering. And just give you an idea of how welded components can distort. For example, when you do welding, for example, you have these 3 situations. So you start welding and then 2 plates, and the thermal strains are resisted by the surrounding material, causing plastic deformation. On cooling, the weld and the heat affected zone tend to contract, and there's contraction again, which is resisted by the surrounding material, causing tensile stress. So that means all the welded components most often will have a tensile stress along this weld zone, like the way you see here in the schematic. To compensate it, you may have a compressive stress away from the heat affected zone. But the problem is, if you have such a kind of stress distribution, it is going to distort. Because anything which has residual stress every component which has a residual stress will be trying to relieve its stress. And in the process of relieving stress, it will distort. And this is not good, because if you end up with distortion of the component, again, as I said, you are ending up with problems. So that led to a very important field called distortion engineering, which was started sometime in 2007 by the German Science Foundation with a funding of around 9.5 million euros. and where several industries came together to set protocols for solving distortion problems. The idea is that you have to identify distortion, you have to quantify distortion, you have to compensate distortion. So what we are now currently talking about is how to quantify distortion using X-ray diffraction and how important it is to use X-ray diffraction techniques or non-destructive evaluation techniques to quantify distortion. But if you really want to solve the problem, all these three factors are important. Now this comes to the next point. Since I told you that distortion is a manifestation of residual stress, I now need to define what residual stress means. Now, as mechanical engineers, all of you know that stresses which remain when stresses are formed when you apply an external load. But we are talking about stresses that remain in the material without the application of an external load. And the origin can be processing and during manufacturing of materials. The most important thing that you must be aware of is that it is algebraically additive to the applied or service stresses. So that makes it very critical. Consequences: the static and dynamic load bearing capacity of engine components can get affected. Distortion is a possibility which can ultimately lead to failure. And if you have a corrosive environment, you had it. For example, the same component, instead of being in Hyderabad or Bangalore, if it is in Chennai, then you can imagine that because of the high levels of humidity, it can already have a different kind of crack initiation and crack growth. So to summarize, the origin for residual stresses can be a variety of reasons: mechanical, all sorts of mechanical operations like machining, rolling, forming, including assembly can cause residual stresses. All thermomechanical treatments like casting, welding, heat treatment can cause residual stresses. All electroplating, carburizing, nitrating, all surface treatments can also cause residual stresses. So you cannot live without residual stresses. You always have residual stresses on the surface. So hence, it's very, very important for you to understand and quantify these residual stresses if you want a distortion-free component and if you want to avoid failures. So this is only to show you how complicated the whole problem is. If you look at once you join the manufacturing industry, you will realize how difficult the problem is. You will see right from the material procurement till the last process until you finish, you can have at several points residual stresses getting into the component. So this is a fishbone chart to tell you how different aspects of design, material, heat treatment, and even finishing operations. In fact, you would not imagine that even finishing operations can cause residual stresses. And they keep on adding, and finally you have residual stresses in the component. So it's very, very important for you to understand the sources of distortion and then address them as and when you can by suitable techniques that you can adopt. But then it's also important to know what kind of residual stresses are we dealing with. So we are actually dealing with two types of stresses. The first one is called macro residual stresses. In XRD terminology, we call it as type 1 stresses. They are present over significantly larger than the grain size. And it can be as large as the size of the component itself. So this is what typically we are looking at when we look at X-ray diffraction techniques. You can also have micro residual stresses. In micro residual stresses, you can have type 2 and type 3 stresses. Type 2 stresses are those where the stresses can vary within the microstructure. That is, let's say you have an aluminum microstructure. From one grain to another grain, you can have stress variation. Or if you're talking about multi-phase materials, between each grains, again, between each phases, you can have different stresses. And you can have different stresses in terms of either it can be tensile or compressive, or even if it is tensile, it can have, or even if it is compressive, it can have a different number. So when the stresses vary across the section of the microstructure, they are called type 2 stresses. Type 3 stresses are stresses which vary within the grain. For example, if you take one single grain, there can be variation of stresses within the grain. For example, if you have precipitates, if you have dislocations. But then, that becomes very difficult to determine type 3 kind of stresses, but type 1 stresses are more important for us. Now, if you try to show how the type 1, type 2, type 3 stresses look like along the microstructures, pictured along with the microstructure, this is how it would look like. Now, this is type 1 stress, which is an average stress. Now, this is type 2 stress, which will now vary from grain to grain. You see that it is mapped with the grain. So you have a tensile stress here, then it comes down here for this grain, it goes up again for this grain, and so on. And within this grain, you can see the variation. So that is type 3. So you should be able to understand what kind of stresses we are talking about. So type 1, type 2, and type 3 stresses. Now, one of the common methods that people use in industry is called hole drilling method. And hole drilling method is a very popular method, very old method. The ASTM standard is E837. And you use this method by simply drilling a hole. And when you drill a hole, the material relaxes, the component relaxes, and the relaxation is measured with the help of a rosette of strain gauges or interferometric or holography techniques. And this is done typically with in many industry because it's a very fast, simple way of doing things. But it's a destructive technique. And you can place the strain gauges in such a way that you can measure strain in the directions that you want, and you can get strain. And please remember, when we talk about stress determination, actually what we are determining is always strain. We calculate stresses. What we actually determine is always strain, but we calculate stresses. There are also other methods which people use in the industry. For example, curvature method is one which people use for coated and plated sheets. So again, the distortion cost can be understood and quantified using simple strength of materials concept. Industries also use sectioning. So you remove a thin layer of material. Therefore, there is a relaxation, and that can be back calculated using appropriate strain gauges. But again, please remember, sectioning or hole drilling technique, they're all destructive techniques. You can also use Raman spectroscopy, but Raman spectroscopy is restricted to materials which are only Raman active. So if you are working in the electronic industry or semiconductor industry, where you deal with silicon and so on, silicon is Raman active, and therefore you can actually determine the peak shifts if there are any stresses, and therefore you can measure the stresses using Raman spectroscopy. But Raman spectroscopy is not a very useful tool in automotive industries, for instance. Now we are talking about diffraction techniques today. So you can use X-ray diffraction technique, which I'll talk about it, neutron diffraction and electron diffraction. X-ray diffraction technique is typically used in all the laboratories. But the problem is it is okay for small penetration depths, because X-ray diffraction has a penetration depth of around in the order of microns. So you can get information in the first few microns of the material. Neutron diffraction has a very large penetration depth. If you are looking at determination of stresses across the section of a large sample, the neutron diffraction is would be useful, but neutron diffraction is not available in academic setup, as you can imagine. Electron diffraction is like bringing an elephant to kill an ant. So electron diffraction in principle can be used, but electron diffraction, I would say, is too difficult to use. So X-ray diffraction, therefore, becomes very useful. And this is the sampling volume that we are talking of. So laboratory X-rays, we are talking about the sampling volume of this kind. As you see here, we are talking about 0.001 to 0.01 millimeter cube. And neutron diffraction is at the other end of the spectrum. So for very large samples, neutron diffraction would be good. For X-rays, laboratory X-rays, you are dealing with small samples with smaller penetration depth. Synchrotron is a high power source, which can be used for some specific kind of experiments, which I'm not going to talk about. Now, how are we, what is the concept of measuring stress using X-ray diffraction? Now, this is a normal lattice, what you see here on the left-hand side, unstressed lattice. And D is the interplanar spacing when there is no stress. Let us assume that there is a tensile stress. When there is a tensile stress, then the atoms are pulled apart. So you have the interplanar spacing changes. So the interplanar spacing has increased. Now this interplanar spacing changes is now captured using Bragg's law, and then using a particular X-ray wavelength, we are going to capture the strain. So that's what we use. So any changes in the interplanar spacing is captured via Bragg's law. And therefore, using the concept of Bragg's law, we determine what is the strain, and therefore from strain we calculate the stresses. And of course, as I said, you have an X-ray source, this polycrystalline sample is there, you have detectors to capture any change in the interplanar spacing. And you might be wondering, can X-rays really do that? Because that is some question that any engineer would ask. Actually, it can. If you look at this table, you will see, let's say we are talking about 2 angstroms, and an X-ray diffraction for copper radiation is supposed to diffract at 22.67 degrees, let us say. Any change in the interplanar spacing from 2 to 2.01 angstrom, that is, we are talking about 0.01 angstrom change, can already lead to changes in the reflection. So changes in the Bragg reflection or changes in the peak positions will reflect what is the change in the interplanar spacing. So therefore, X-ray diffraction is very, very sensitive to interplanar spacing changes. And therefore, it's a very, very useful tool that can be captured for, or that can be used for solving engineering problems. Now, how are we using Bragg's law for solving residual stress problems? Now, if you look at this, now we are talking about a material. It could be any material, any component. It could be welded component. It could be cast component. So you have a source, X-ray source. Only those crystals which are satisfying Bragg's law are detected by the detector. And we measure the strain in which and the direction in which we are interested in. Let us say it's on the surface of the sample. It could be any, as I said, it could be any sample. And we are always measuring residual strains and calculate the stresses. Now, unlike powder diffraction, for residual stress measurements, we need to decide what is the peak that is important for us to consider. That's a very important aspect. So selection of a diffraction peak is a very important aspect when you talk about residual stresses. Now, typically, we are looking at a peak which is at a very high angle. You may be asking, why is that? Now, it is so because if you look at higher angles, we are talking about theta here, theta of 80 degrees or 90 degrees. So 2 theta will be 180 degrees if you talk of maximum 2 theta. So at higher scattering angles, the errors that are involved will be extremely low. So any changes in delta 2 theta that you would experience in measuring will translate to very less changes in delta sine theta. Therefore, to accurately measure the strain, so you can see that the strain here is given by delta d by d. Now, what is delta d by d? Delta d is the change in the interplanar spacing divided by the original spacing. And you know, from the basic definition of strain is nothing but your changed deformation by the original shape that gives you the strain in a particular direction. So X-ray diffraction almost functions like a strain gauge to you, so that because we are able to measure what is delta d, and we know what is d already, and therefore delta d by d gives you the strain. And to make sure that this strain is calculated accurately, we have to go for a high angle peak. So typically we are looking at angles, 2 theta angles or peaks which are in the range of 140 to 160. And that's what we are going to use for calculating residual stresses. And we also have the possibility of using a wide range of psi angles. I have not told you what psi angle is. Please wait for a couple of minutes until I define what psi angle means. In fact, for most of the residual stress measurements, we use a specialized equipment, which is not a typical powder diffractometer. We use a goniometer, which is capable of side tilting. I'm yet to explain what this means. I will do it in the next coming slides. What is that we are using to measure stresses? But just to brief you, at this point of time, we are talking about X-ray tube and the detector, which are mounted on separate rails. So that means we are talking about a goniometer that does not have a physical center. So therefore, making the size of the sample a non-issue, which means we use some specific X-ray diffractometers, which doesn't have to follow Bragg-Brentano geometry. If you remember, I started my discussion by talking about Bragg-Brentano geometry. Bragg-Brentano geometry has to be satisfied in a normal powder diffractometer where the sample has to be kept at the center of the goniometer. But in this specific case, that is not required. So that is the advantage. Now you may be wondering why that is important. In fact, I just want to highlight one fact. If you take iron specimen, let's say we are talking about chromium radiation, a peak shift of the 211 peak at 156 degrees 2 theta will be 3.6 times the peak shift of 200 peak at 105 degrees, and 2 theta and 6.9 times the peak shift of the 110 peak at 68 degrees 2 theta. What it essentially means is, if you choose a low angle peak, then the peak shift that you are going to consider will be that less accurate. That's what it means. So that means if you want to measure stress in a ferrous sample, it's good to take a 211 peak at 156 degrees 2 theta, so that any measurement errors that you are going to encounter there will not reflect in the strain measurements. And therefore, the strain that you are going to calculate in ferrous samples by choosing a 211 peak at 156 degree 2 theta will give you a much higher accuracy in terms of strain that you are going to calculate. So therefore, selection of the right diffraction peak is important. You must remember, I started with one point. I said, if you want to really work on distortion engineering problems, you need to have a strong background in all the three subjects. You need to know X-ray diffraction. You need to have a background in mechanical engineering. a bit of mechanics and bit of design. And it's important to have some knowledge in metallurgy. So unless you have basic knowledge in all these three subjects, you will not be able to interpret these results properly, and you will not be able to get accurate estimates properly. So to summarize, we have to have the right diffraction peak for us to get accurate answers. So this is how you typically deal with. You typically get a peak, and this peak, the background has to be removed. The background has to be removed. And when you deal with a certain peak, I was telling you that for example, for a ferrous sample, we are talking about 156 degrees 2 theta. That is, imagine that we are dealing with that peak. So that peak, experimental peak, when we get, we fit a mathematical function. Because only when we fit a mathematical function, we can define the exact peak position, we can get the integrated intensity all accurately. So some of the popular mathematical functions that we use is like Gaussian function or a Lorentzian function, or a combination of Gaussian and Lorentzian, which we call it as pseudo-Fock function. We also use Pearson-7 function in our lab once in a while, and which is used to fit the experimental data point. So when you get an X-ray diffractogram, and particularly when you get a certain peak for measurement of stress, the next step that you have to do is remove the background and fit a appropriate mathematical function which fits this experimental profile perfectly. There are also absorption issues. Please remember, I already talked about absorption. So, even recently somebody was asking me exact penetration depth of X-rays. In fact, that is a bit difficult to say. Exact penetration depth, I cannot say. I can only tell an average of how much penetration depth could be, because this angle can vary. And at low angles, the penetration depth is much, much lower. At a little higher angle, the penetration depth can be a little bit higher. But the volume will be always the same. But what we can say is that typically we are talking about penetration depths in the order of around microns. So that much, if you know about X-rays and X-ray absorption, that is sufficient at this point of time. I told you that I introduced in the previous slides a concept called angle psi. And now I would like to tell you what the psi means. Now we define an angle psi, which is nothing but the angle between the reflecting plane. What is the reflecting plane? A crystal plane, the normal to the crystal plane is defined as n, and the geometrical surface normal to that is defined as L. So the angle between the geometrical surface normal and the crystal plane normal is defined as psi. Now you can see here, now in this specific case, the surface normal and the crystal plane normal coincide, and therefore psi is equal to 0. Now in this specific case, the crystal is oriented in some direction. So now therefore n, which is the normal to crystal plane, is here, and L is the normal to the surface. So the angle between the surface normal and the crystal plane normal is now psi. And this concept of psi angles we use to calculate strain from various crystals of various orientations. So that is why I said I was talking about psi tilting, and this psi tilting is possible with some of the modern goniometers, which are specifically meant for that. And you need to define the laboratory axis. You need to know what axis you are dealing with. Otherwise, if you do not specify the coordinate system, then you will not know in which direction you are actually measuring the strain. For example, in a three-dimensional case, now the strain phi psi here basically refers to strain calculated on any direction, in any angle, at any angle psi. See, that is the powerful, it's a very powerful technique. So what I wanted to tell you here is you can measure strain in any direction, which is not possible with any other mechanical technique. You can, for example, if you take a cylindrical sample, I can measure stress along the tangential direction, along the axial direction, along the radial direction, or any direction. So that makes it very, very powerful. So you can measure strain as a function of phi and psi. What is phi? Phi is the angle along the surface. That is 360 degrees, 0 to 360 degrees. Basically giving you axis on the surface, able to measure strain in any direction on the surface. So the strain phi psi in three dimensions can be calculated using X-ray diffraction. Now, to make this concept a little bit more simple, we are talking about strain in any direction, which is d phi psi minus d naught by d naught. That is nothing but your basic, all mechanical engineers should be able to relate this. This is nothing but the change in the interplanar spacing in any given direction divided by the original interplanar spacing. So d phi psi is the spacing change. When, for example, let us say that you have subjected your specimen to a compressive stress, the interplanar spacing in that direction might have changed. might have reduced. So that is what is this d phi psi minus d naught. D naught is the unstressed spacing. So this will give you the strain in that direction. So therefore, this would be a very generic definition which will give you strain in any direction. And that gives us enormous flexibility in measuring the strain in any direction. Now, if you calculate, I mean, using basic theory of elasticity, you can calculate the strain in terms of stresses and in terms of the angle phi and psi. You will be able to get an analytical expression like this. But then the problem is not as complicated as it appears here. But I have to also highlight one more factor. There are two constants here called S1 and S2, which are called extraelastic constants, and now expressed in terms of nu and E. These are extraelastic constants which needs to be used for the calculation of strain. Now, in the previous slide, I used a three-dimensional equation, and it is not as complicated as it is shown in the previous slide. And since most of the times we are dealing with strains on the surface, that equation can be simply reduced to a biaxial stress condition, and that equation gets reduced to a simple linear equation of this form. And now, if you look at this equation, it's a very simple linear equation of strain as a function of sine square psi. And if you plot this d phi psi as a function of sine square psi, the linear fit to this data will give me this strain, or will give me the stress in that specific direction. That is how we calculate the stress. So you understand how easy it is and how powerful the technique is. So if you are able to get the strain information or the interplanar spacing changes from various crystals at various orientations for various side tilts, then using various side tilts, then you can get the stress for that specific direction by simply taking the slope. And the intercept is the sum of the principal stresses. So that is how we actually calculate stress. And it's a very important part, because when you are dealing with industries coming with various sorts of problems, and when you want to calculate stresses, you must know how to measure this, and you must know which component of stress is important and how to measure the stresses. And you need to have a background so that you are interpreting the data properly. And this technique is called as the sine square psi technique. And since we use multiple side tilts, it is called multiple exposure sine square psi technique across the world. So this technique is very popularly called multiple exposure sine square psi technique worldwide. And it's a common technique everybody uses across the world. And you can have different kinds of situations. You can end up with this kind of a linear curve. And if you have shear stress, you end up with this kind of a curve, which we call it as sine square psi split. And if you have gradient to the surface, it is non-linear. And again, when you have large variation stresses, again, it's non-linear. These becomes very complicated. So I'm not going to discuss these kind of issues. Typically, we are able to handle the first two cases where the data is linear, or when you have this kind of a sine square psi split. It's very important that you choose D naught very accurately, because if you don't choose D naught accurately, then you may end up with, inaccurate results. Typically, this is taken care of in the software. You know what should be the D naught for a given material. But if it is not there, then you can get D naught by taking filings of that material and calculate. Because filings will not be able to sustain its stresses, so they'll be stress-free. So basically, you need to calculate D naught for samples which are stress-free. And another important aspect is, if you want to calculate strain, and subsequently, if you want to calculate stresses, you need extraelastic constants. Extraelastic constants for a given peak is not simply elastic constants from mechanical testing handbook. So you cannot simply use the bulk elastic modulus and Poisson's ratio to do that. You need extraelastic constants to do that. And you cannot use single crystal elastic constants because you are dealing with polycrystalline samples. In polycrystalline samples, you have grain boundaries. So you cannot use single crystal elastic constants because they are highly anisotropic. And how do we do that? You need to calibrate. So many times when we deal with these kind of situations for standard materials, the extraelastic constants are already available in the database. The software will have it. If it is not the case, then you need to calibrate and then do it. For example, if you're working on an entirely new material which is not there in the database, then you need to calibrate and get the extraelastic constants. So this is how it would look like, the schematic of schematic of the whole process. Typically, we will have two detectors, left and right detector. And we have the possibility to tilt the samples in all the three directions, all the axes, omega axis, phi axis, and chi axis. Phi axis, you can see, phi axis gives you possibility to measure stress in any direction on the surface. and the component of stress measured is in this direction, in the direction of the tilt. So basically, the reason why I'm showing this to you is this gives enormous flexibility or tremendous possibility to measure stress in any direction. I think no other technique can give you such kind of possibility to measure stresses in any direction of interest. You need to know how it looks like. So this is not a powder diffractometer. So this is a diffractometer specifically meant for measuring stresses. You see a gear has been kept here. This is an X-ray source. And there's a chiller. There's not a chiller. There's a cooler here. We use simply a cooling liquid to cool the anode X-ray tube. As I told you that X-ray production process is a very inefficient process. A lot of heat is generated. You need to keep cooling the target continuously. So you require cooling. And this is a tabletop X-ray diffractometer meant for residual stress measurements. A closer look of that is here. So you see the left detector and the right detector, X-ray source. So collimator here helps us to collimate the beam. So it helps us to determine how much the X-ray can be irradiated. So it helps us to fix the beam size. For example, you can see chromium tube here. So we can change the X-ray source depending on what metals that we are dealing with. I told you that the detectors and tubes are mounted on different rails. So therefore, this doesn't have to follow the Bragg-Brentano geometry. The concept of keeping the sample at the center of the goniometer does not exist here, unlike what you would see in the powder diffractometer. So it's that way. It is again very flexible. You can handle different samples of different size and shape to measure stresses. And this is an example of how we were measuring stress of a spring used in automobile. And the inner surface of the spring is being investigated. The red on the right hand side, you will see the red line here. So that is the experimental data. So you see that the peak has been captured at 156 degrees. I've been telling you in the previous slides that we take 156 degrees 2 theta peak, which gives us accurate estimation of the strain. Now the blue line here is the fit, mathematical fit. I could use, as I said, I could use Gaussian function or a Pearson-7 function or a Lorentzian function. I use a mathematical function to fit my experimental data, and rest of the calculations are made. In this specific case, you see that we get around minus 490 stress. That is, it's a compressive stress here on the surface, and with a standard deviation of 8 MPa. A standard deviation of 8 MPa is very good because the machine accuracy is in the order of around 20 MPa, plus or minus 20 MPa. So minus 490 is very good. You also have a small amount of shear stress. And you can see that this spring is rotated at 45 degrees. So basically the interest here was to measure the stress on the inner surface of the spring at 45 degrees. If you wanted me to measure at 60 degrees, I could have measured. If you wanted me to measure at 90 degrees, I could have measured. So that gives us the flexibility to measure stress on the surface in any direction. And that's what you would do. And now sometimes you may have to measure stresses as a function of depth. And if you want to do that, then we have to do electropolishing. So we use an electrolyte in this ratio. Acetic acid is to perchloric acid in the ratio of 1:5. So we can etch the sample. And once you etch the sample, you can etch it and remove the material to some extent. And then you can measure the stress. So that gives you the stress as a function of depth. So when you want to measure stress as a function of depth, then that is called as depth profiling. And this is how it would look like. So when you do depth profiling for, let's say we are talking about short pinning. So let's say that you have short pinned a component and we are measuring the residual stress as a function of depth. Now stress is denoted on the y-axis in MPa, and plus indicates tensile stress, minus indicates compressive stress. Depth in millimeters has been indicated here. And it's a low intensity pin here, red one, and blue one is a high intensity pin. You can see that as a function of depth, stress has been measured. All the data points are shown here. So that means the stress keeps increasing as you go further, as you keep removing the material by electropolishing and measure stresses, you get an idea of how the stresses vary as a function of depth, that is from the surface to a certain depth. And at some point of time, it will be compensated by compressive stress. But because the sample has to be in static equilibrium, so therefore it has to go to the compressive stress on the other side. But what is important for us to understand the first half to see how the compressive stresses vary. And you can see that when you have a high intensity pin, you can introduce a compressive stress as high as -1 GPa. That's very high, by the way. So this is called depth profiling, which is done using electropolishing. And the instrumentation, as I said, you can accommodate large, heavier samples, and we can access very large 2 theta, which is not possible in powder diffractometers. More axis of rotation is possible, unlike standard diffractometer. We use sine square psi method to calculate this. You may be wondering, I have not talked about sample preparation. Mechanical methods such as grinding, machining, and so on should not be done. For example, if somebody comes with a sample and asks you to measure a stress, you cannot do any surface preparation. You should not do that because you will create an artifact. If you have a painted material, it's okay because so long the X-rays can penetrate through the paint, it is still okay. If the paint is too thick and if the intensities come down, then possibly we have to think of removing the paint without any destructive methodology. And you know that we work on Bragg diffraction, and therefore Bragg diffraction always works for crystalline materials. If you're talking about stresses in amorphous metals, we cannot do using X-ray diffraction. Sometimes, you may have to cut the samples because let's say you have a very huge boiler and I want to measure the stress on the surface. I cannot bring a boiler tube to my lab. So then I may have to section the material. Then in that case, you cannot cut using hacksaw or something like that. It's better to use wire cut or electrode discharge machining because you cannot afford to have heating and relax the stresses. As far as possible, heating should be avoided, but electrode discharge machining would help you to cut the samples wherever required to take it to the lab and measure the stresses. And one last example, again, I had shown this earlier, but I would like to show this once again. I told you that, surface grinding is a process where nobody would imagine that stresses can be generated, but it can be generated depending on who is actually doing the surface grinding process. The dots here, what you see here, basically refers to what kind of collimator you use. For example, I can have a very small collimator, that is, reduce the diameter of the beam and actually get a very fine description of the stress. But if I use a larger beam diameter, then I get an average stress. So it is also important to realize how should be the beam diameter, what should be the beam diameter, so that I can get stresses accordingly. So it's, for example, if you're looking at the root of the gear, you have to see whether the X-ray beam diameter, the size has to be reduced or not. You cannot use the same X-ray beam for all kinds of samples. So therefore, it's very important for you to choose the appropriate collimators to get useful data. And of course, you use any machine, you have errors. And every machine will give you some results. We call it as garbage in, garbage out. If you put garbage in, some garbage out will come. So it's very important as an engineer to see and make sure what kind of errors will creep in and how to avoid errors. So, and how to avoid propagation of errors. So very, very important to take care of, you cannot have specimen curvatures, for example. Be careful when you're doing sample preparation. And instrumental errors, geometrical errors have to be taken care. You have to use this right diffraction peak. What kind of methods you use for peak location. All these are very important. And make sure that the error propagation is limited. And these things you can only do when you have a strong background in X-ray diffraction. And you can understand in which direction you can measure stress, or you need to measure stress only when you have strong background in mechanical engineering and mechanics. Only if you have strong background in metallurgy, you can understand how to apply correction factors. So that is why I told you, you require all these 3 areas or knowledge in all these 3 areas to make some useful sense out of these measurements. And I would like to summarize because I thought I should close by 11:15 or 11:20 so that I can receive questions because I did not want to keep talking. I would like to summarize. We are talking about crystalline materials and we are talking about elastic strain. And we are talking about a set of crystals of the same type, same plane, and we get the strain measured using diffraction. And it is not equivalent to mechanical strain. So that you should remember, because mechanical strain is an average strain over all crystallites. We are calculating X-ray diffraction strain by X-ray diffraction. And we are using a very popular, well-known technique called multiple exposure sine square psi technique. When you calculate the strain as a function of sine square psi, the slope will give you the stress in that direction. So you have to make sure that errors do not propagate, minimize errors at all stages. Last but not the least, as I said, I have been emphasizing this fact quite often that you require strong background in metallurgy, basic knowledge in mechanics and X-ray diffraction to make sure that your measurements are accurate and correct interpretation is provided. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for you to interpret the data. I have some video of the machine, how it runs. Maybe you can have a look at it so that you know how it works. So there is a sample here. Of course, this is not a metallurgical sample, it's a ceramic sample, but that is sufficient. It's sufficient for you to know how it looks like. So you have the collimator here. The detectors are there, L1 and R2 are the detectors. So X-rays are coming here. We are using a copper source. Now the idea is that it is now subjected to various cytids. So it is trying to collect information from crystals of various orientations. But which plane is of interest to you is already decided. But we collect crystals which are oriented in all directions for that particular plane. We do it for both, we call it as plus side tilt and minus side tilt for both this direction as well as the other direction. You may be wondering that there is no shielding here. The shielding is not important here because the X-ray power source is very small here. So therefore, an extra shielding is not required. But of course, it doesn't mean that you can put your hand under the X-ray. I mean, unless one has suicidal tendencies. So you should not put your hand under the X-ray beam. But it is not very dangerous. You can keep yourself 1 meter away from this equipment when it is in operation. So it's okay. And it's important for us to keep this distance, the distance between the sample surface and the X-ray. We require a certain nodal distance. That is important for us to get the beam recorded, the diffraction signal recorded. And as I told you previously, we can change the X-ray source. Now, for example, here I'm choosing copper. Now, let us say I want to measure strain in stainless steel. I will have to change it to manganese. And for titanium alloys, I will change it to copper. And for many of the ferrous alloys, I choose maybe chromium. So like this, it is possible for me to change the radiation. So I think with this, I would close, and I would like to receive questions from people if there are any questions. And thank you for listening. So the idea of this talk was basically to make you feel how important X-ray diffraction technique is for engineers. Of course, this is a topic that I discuss the entire semester for 4 or 5 months, and it's very difficult to summarize everything in 1.5 hours. But this talk was primarily intended to give you an idea of the importance of X-ray diffraction techniques for solving engineering problems, not go too much into depth. We can always meet once again if you have specific doubts on certain aspects of X-ray diffraction. But this talk was primarily intended to highlight the fact that X-ray diffraction technique is an important engineering tool. So thank you very much.